Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those who are joining us today. My name is Alancay Morales. I am the Global Advocacy Coordinator for Indigenous Peoples Rights International, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to the criminalization, to this side event during the expert mechanism on the criminalization of Indigenous peoples on the global trends with a focus on Colombia. And I'll welcome our first, the person that will do the introductory remarks, which is Ms. Sandra Creamer, who is from the Wanji Kalkadoon Indigenous Peoples in Australia. She's a member of Indigenous Peoples Rights International Global Board of Directors. And Sandra is the CEO of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Women's Alliance. And she's a lawyer and an adjunct professor in public health at the University of Queensland. And Sandra, I forgot to mention that she's also the chair of the board of directors. So thank you very much for joining us. And Sandra, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, everybody. I welcome you all here today as the chair of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, which is an organisation that works to protect Indigenous peoples' rights and unite and amplify the call for justice to victims of criminalisation and impunity. And I acknowledge all the lands and territories that you are all on. The session is called Criminalisation of Indigenous Peoples Global Trend with a Focus on Colombia. The trend is Indigenous people who are connected to their lands and territories are the protectors, stewardships to our Mother Earth. Yet in the colonial law, we are seen as criminals, and we are defending our rights to ensure the land, waters, and living things remain clear and healthy. The colonial law, though, does not see or understand or realise that we are protecting for all. And for them, they look at the land as money and commodity. In this event, you'll hear from Indigenous people who are involved in groundwork. They come with their hearts, spirits and communities and share their life, work, dedication from their different perspectives, expertise, frontline actions as Indigenous women and men, as movement builders, educators who are engaged on the front line through their Indigenous communities and organisations. I will now open it up and each speaker will introduce themselves, and I will start off by welcoming my colleague from IPRI, Joyce Gurria, as the first presentation. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sandra. So let me just share my screen. Right. So this is okay. Thank you for those who were able to join us for this side event. It's good evening from our side of the world. I'm currently in the Philippines. So I'll briefly present our report on our annual report for this year, covering 2021, on report on criminalization, violence, and impunity against Indigenous peoples. The pre-publication version of this report we've also presented this during UNPFII. So for this presentation, we have other information that we wanted to also present, and of course the full report is now available for download on our website. I'll share that in the link for you to download the report after my presentation. Currently, only the English version is available, but we'll make the French, Spanish, and Portuguese versions available at the very latest at the end of this month. We'll be sharing this to our networks, and of course for those who particularly attending this side event. So in our report, we are presenting 19 case stories from our 6 focus countries, which is, as you can see, from here, it's Colombia, Brazil, Mexico in Latin America. And then we have Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, and then Philippines and India for Asia. So these are the titles of the reports, so you can see. If you download the report, then you read more on these stories. And this is just to present, because each of the focus countries, we have country partners, and this is their a summary of the cases that they have documented or shared with us to be included in this report. Of course, the overview and findings of the report is not limited to the experience or the cases or the context of these focus countries, but also includes other reports of organizations that are also doing documentation of human rights violations in general of land and environmental defenders, which of course includes Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. So just to highlight the trends and challenges with regards to documentation, so obviously there's a very limited, there's a dearth of official country data for reasons that we probably already know. And then the disaggregation of data by ethnicity within the general data of land and environment defenders is still a challenge, because there is in recent years or within this year and late last year, there's been an increase of interest to properly document from interest from other organizations to properly document cases of human rights violations that involve environmental and land defenders. Of course, for IPRI, we primarily focus on Indigenous peoples. Other organizations or networks where IPRI is also a part of is more conscious in also helping us within the data disaggregation. So this details of this is also part of our report. And the other reasons with regards to documentation really is, which we have we've highlighted these concerns in our previous report. So this year is our second official report of releasing an annual criminalization report. But just to mention, there's a lack of free press, and of course, which is linked to the issue on democratization or shrinking of civic space, or the rise of authoritarian governments worldwide. So there's a fear of reporting of attacks as they are carried with impunity, and of course, cases happen in or cases that are happening in areas that are too remote to be picked up by mainstream media, or have limited access to internet to actually report this as social media, because many organizations, local organizations or grassroots organizations use social media as an avenue to also share what's happening on the ground. The other trends and challenges when it comes to these cases, the criminalization and human rights violation in general, is the killings and criminalization happen along with other human rights violations. During displacement, there's torture, there's enforced disappearance, and also Indigenous leaders are primarily attacked, primarily to weaken the strength of the community or the unity of Indigenous communities. And the attack of Indigenous leaders almost always happen within the context of attacks of the Indigenous community where the Indigenous leader is a part of. And usually there's an issue of where the Indigenous community as a community is demanding for right for self-determination or other demands of human rights. But the individual is almost always, or the leaders almost always linked to a wider issue that involves human rights violations within the community. And many cases of human rights violations are justified under security anti-terrorist laws. Indigenous peoples activists and human rights defenders are tagged as members of armed groups, communists, Naxalites, and Maoists. The case stories of India, the Philippines, and DRC provides this kind of stories. This was missed, but as Sandra has mentioned earlier, other laws that are a result of colonization still continue to haunt Indigenous communities and Indigenous leaders. They're used to also criminalize their activities, especially within the context of conservation. And then militarization of indigenous peoples' territories, which is also common in other areas, in areas of indigenous communities beyond our 6 focus countries, increases the cases of human rights violations, wherein, of course, state security agents enjoy a sense of impunity. And usually there's lack of political will for governments to actually address specific programs or actions that involve armed groups or vigilantes. Case stories from Latin America, from partners, from our partners from Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, present that kind of challenge. And of course, this long-running lack of political will from governments actually address this leaves territories of indigenous peoples often unsafe and unlivable. So there's enforced disappearance and other kinds of human rights violations, torture and killing, of course, are almost present there. And then again, with hate speech, vilification and smear campaigns, both online and offline, are linked to many of the cases of human rights violations. And those that are done in social media are spread faster and have wider reach. The other observations, violence and attacks are extended to the collective, as mentioned earlier, either to their organizations or indigenous groups and communities, if not both. In many cases, their families are also targeted. Most targeted are indigenous leaders as a way to attack and weaken the governance structures of communities and peoples. The cases of killings and criminalization is often preceded by threats and attacks aimed either at instilling fear or delegitimizing efforts to defend their rights. And I think the report of UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Offenders had that highlighted, her reports from last year. Like in general, these trends have also been present in the cases that we presented from last year. So this is more of a continuation of the current issues, if not worsening of issues of attacks against indigenous people, still linked to their demands for self-determination and, of course, within the context of their land rights, territories, and resources. So I think that's where I end my presentation. I hope I did not go over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joyce, for your remarks on the latest changes in relation to, or latest events on the cases of criminalization and these ongoing trends and profoundly concerning trends. And now I give the floor to Leonor Salawata. And just to mention that Leonor is an indigenous activist from the Arhuaco organization in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia. She's a human rights commissioner of the Tairona Indigenous Confederation. And Leonor also is a board member of Indigenous Peoples Rights International. Thank you for joining us today, Leonor, and the floor is yours.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I would like to talk about this topic. As a Colombian indigenous person, criminalization cases and abusing power is something that happens against Colombian indigenous peoples. I would like to make an introduction after having closed the Commission for Truth about Colombia. In some of their conclusions, we were told that if in Colombia we had to keep a minute of silence for each victim, for each crime committed against us, we would have to shut up for 17 years in silence, and there is impunity. I would like to say that after the signing of the agreement between the FARC guerrillas and the Colombian government, there is a coexistence with desperation and hope for indigenous peoples. On the one hand, the little positive transformations in the lives of indigenous peoples are fragile in the rural world after the agreement, but simultaneously, in the middle of all of this new war cycle, there's a nostalgia of that future that we were hoping for in peace, the peace of indigenous peoples, something that we haven't buried, criminalizing. We keep killing indigenous people, some more than others, but it's really symbolic that the Nariño department with Arua peoples and the Cauca one with the Nasa peoples keep killing many indigenous peoples in this country. Well, even when we cannot ignore the future vision of our society and a better future, a better life, we cannot be naive, and we cannot be accomplices to a present that is still seeing war, criminalization, and abuses of power. They are taking our lands away as indigenous peoples in Colombia, and in the middle of the lack of compliance of peace agreements signed with the FARC and the closing of the dialogues with the National Liberation Army, violence, socio-political violence has increased. The genocide against leaders and defenders of human rights at the same time as guerrillas are more present, paramilitary groups, cartels, both national and international drug dealing cartels that have worsened violence against indigenous communities and the misappropriation of their lands. Violence against defenders of human rights, of lands and environmental defenders after the peace agreements of 2016, violations of human rights, infractions of humanitarian rights were significantly reduced in the country. However, in indigenous territories, this change was very short and it didn't last long. Paramilitary groups, the National Liberation Army, and criminal organizations, together with the government policy for safety and fight against drugs and the urgency to implement extractive projects and infrastructure projects, made indigenous peoples a military target against, and it started a cultural and physical genocide. According to the Development for Peace Institute, between 2016 and the 9th of June of 2020, 279 indigenous peoples have been killed. In 2020, there were 47 homicides, 14 of which died during lockdown because of COVID-19. In Cauca 28, in Taqueta 3, etc. There are departments that have seen more victims during 2020. The number of victims per year, according to the INDEPA database, can be summarized in the following way. In 2016, 31 victims. In 2017, 45. In 2018, 62. In 2019, 84. In 2020, 47 people. And in total, 279 leaders and human rights defenders that were indigenous during these years, from 2016 to 2020. During the period from 2016 to 2019, homicides of indigenous leaders were concentrated, especially in the departments of Cauca, Nariño, Chocó, and Putumayo, and most victims were linked to territorial defense processes. The Cauca department gathers many of the conflicts that impact other territories, and there's a presence of communities. There's a lot of conflict with private sector, legal and illegal activities regarding the wood industry, livestock industry, crops, mining industry, concentration of lands, gas projects, oil projects, restitution processes, expansion and restructuring of reserves, disputes between criminal bodies and mafias groups for the exploitation of rents associated to illegal activities, and many processes and activities regarding the protection of, again, oil and mining companies. Later, after the peace agreements were signed in indigenous territories, we have seen historical forms of violence come back, like stigmatization, like forced displacement, and there's been a worsening of new non-lethal types of criminalization, of stigmatization, hate speech, breaking organizations, stimulating conflicts between and among indigenous peoples, and other effective ways to reduce our autonomy, our self-governance, and our collective capacity to defend our territories.
La represión de los crímenes.
Repression of crimes as an answer to the uprising, the social mobilization between 2019 and 2020, current and late and recent protests because of the brutal violence of the police, especially in the cases of the youth in demonstrations at the time. We saw 14 people die and more than 300 were injured. And it was considered a legitimate response against these demonstrators. And I would also like to mention that violent acts against indigenous peoples during the national strike in 2021 and homicide. We saw 5 victims of indigenous organizations. There were 12 injured people, again, from indigenous organizations. I would like to compare with the number of homicides and injured during the protest, the response of the government, the recent order to militarize our country and impunity against these crimes. This allowed lethal violence to be used against protesters. It's considered now a state policy that exponentially increases the number of civilian casualties, and it suppresses personal freedoms like the right to peaceful protest. Indigenous communities identify as an act of criminalization both the methods of institutions that belong to the state to confront unfriendly political views and other actions by the state that lead to violations of fundamental rights like autonomy, self-determination, authority. And a good example is the report of criminalization presented reported by the National Indigenous Peoples Colombian organization by Victoria Tauli Corpus as a special rapporteur in March 2018, where it was highlighted that there have been homicides against Indigenous leaders in the context of violence against Indigenous peoples. And after the signing of the peace agreements between the FARC and the Colombian government, this dialogue, this concept of criminalization allows to classify different ways of criminalization within a very complex context of networks, relationships, stakeholders that have been created to comply with the state project to undermine the lifestyles of Indigenous peoples. Power abuse is a concept that relates to actions and violent measures that lead to violations of Indigenous peoples' rights and defenders of human rights, of the environment. And as a consequence, they tend to silence the voices that oppose the government, especially those who oppose big projects like mining projects in the Andean region. There are three phenomena here. Abusing institution standards relate to the monopoly of the state in the production, interpretation and implementation of laws, and the systematic way in which they benefit company projects. Abusing power through racist and stigmatization speech stemming leads to them having a voice that goes beyond the media because they want to criminalize and they want to undermine and stigmatize the fight for the rights of Indigenous peoples, human rights, territorial and environmental rights. I didn't have time to finish everything that I had written, but I have left behind a lot of information, a lot of examples of killings and impunity. Territories are victims, the policies that break Indigenous peoples, that criminalize autonomy, self-governance, self-determination. This leads to criminalization of our cultures. This is something that Constitutional Act 004 has made clear. We are in a situation of extermination of Indigenous peoples in Colombia in 2009. And this report goes all the way to 2021. With this, I would like to thank those of you who are listening to me and IPRI for organizing this event. Thank you so much for giving me this chance.
Thank you very much, Leonor, for those remarks. And indeed, the report on the case of Colombia highlights numerous issues that are very concerning in terms of the methods that the government is implementing, and as well the weakening of institutional bodies that are responsible for overseeing the situation and the rights of Indigenous peoples. So we're hoping that with the recent change in the president of Colombia, that hopefully this situation changes for better for Indigenous peoples, and especially given all the progress that was made with the peace accords, that actually the peace accords in conjunction with the new administration can lead us in a path for more peace for indigenous peoples and for the full enjoyment of their territories in peace without all these new trends and methods that the government is implementing in their exercise of abuse of power. So thank you very much for that, Leonor. And now we have a recorded statement by the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, Ms. Mary Lawler. May I request my colleague Ivan to put the video on, please?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to participate in the event today. I'm sorry I can't be with you live. Violations of the rights of Indigenous peoples are carried out with impunity across the globe, and those who take a stand to defend their rights run great risks for doing so. Since I took up the mandate in 2020, I've sent over 69 communications to governments and other actors raising concerns about Indigenous rights defenders at risk. In some cases, governments respond, while in others they leave these concerns unanswered. On only a very few occasions is there accountability for the attacks and threats Indigenous rights defenders face, and the impunity that results builds an environment enabling further attacks. Colombia is one of the countries in which this pattern is deeply entrenched. My predecessor on the mandate carried out an unofficial visit to the country in 2018. In his report, which followed the visit, he highlights civil society data which indicated 167 Indigenous leaders who had been killed since the signing of the peace agreement. This is shocking. And the information I continue to receive since I took up the mandate shows that these killings are continuing. Over the last 2 years, I have raised concerns about risks for individual human rights defenders in the country more than 12 times. 5 of these cases concerned Indigenous rights defenders at risk. The most recent addressed the killing of 3 Indigenous rights defenders and a young Indigenous boy in the Cauca region. While killings represent the most egregious attacks on human rights defenders, they are only the tip of the iceberg. Very often they are preceded by acts of intimidation, harassment, physical attacks and threats, with some state actors implicated, but also paramilitary groups in the Colombian context and transnational corporations. The responsibilities of business towards human rights defenders, including Indigenous rights defenders, is of serious concern to me. The new government in Colombia has an obligation to reverse the cycle of impunity and attacks that surround defending the rights of Indigenous people in the country. And that has to involve making it clear to business that they are expected to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and human rights defenders. I plan to engage the government on these issues in the near future. Thank you very much again for having me, and I wish you all a useful, informative event.
Thank you, Ivan, and thanking as well the Special Rapporteur for her remarks. And we also have the remarks from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Mr. Francisco Cali. Ivan, can you please put the statement? Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon for all of you. It is a great honor and privilege to join you today and share remarks for today's side event on the criminalization of Indigenous people at the global level and more specifically in Colombia. I would like to congratulate and thank Indigenous Peoples Rights International for organizing this gathering to discuss global trends on the criminalization, violence, and impunity against Indigenous peoples. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has on many occasions expressed grave concern at the drastic increase in attacks and acts of violence, criminalization, and threat against indigenous peoples, particularly those that arise in the context of large-scale projects involving extractive industries, agribusiness, infrastructure, hydroelectric dams, and logging. Since the start of my appointment as a Special Rapporteur in May 2020, in collaboration with other special procedures experts, about 60% of the communication we sent concerned attacks, arbitrary detention, violation of freedom of assembly, criminalization, and killing of indigenous human rights defenders. In the vast majority of cases, this violation occurred in the courses of protest or actions to protect indigenous land from the development of projects approved without the consent of indigenous peoples. In 2018, my predecessor dedicated her thematic report on the Human Rights Council to global analysis of attack against and decriminalization of indigenous human rights defenders, and made note of significant concern in Colombia, where an escalation of violence against indigenous people was observed. In the report, it was noted that most killing of human rights defenders are taking place in rural areas where the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army, known as FARC-EP, was historically present, and indigenous people are among the most affected. Furthermore, since the signing of the peace agreement between the government and FARC-EP in 2016, dozens of indigenous leaders have been killed. The continuous presence of the National Liberation Army and the increasing threats from the attacks by former paramilitary groups aggravated the situation. In my own report, I have also addressed the serious issue and the significant impact that criminalization has for indigenous people enjoyment for their rights. My recent report in COVID-19 highlighted legislative proposals and state-sanctioned laws that reduce penalties for environmental violation, criminalized indigenous human rights defenders, and weaken or remove environmental impact assessment and public participation requirements. Additionally, the enforcement of COVID-19 measures is being used to strengthen authoritarian and militarized responses and crackdowns on civic space, as laws are enacted that restrict freedom of expression and target human rights defenders. Furthermore, in my report on the right of indigenous people in urban areas, I underlined that criminalization of indigenous people engaged in peaceful protest to protect their lands have exacerbated the encroachment of indigenous ancestral land and territories. Beyond thematic reports, I would also like to make note of several communications submitted by this mandate to the government of Colombia, highlighting the human rights challenges for indigenous people, including the criminalization and violence committed against indigenous human rights defenders. Most recently, in March 2022, I submitted a letter supported by an urgent public press release requesting further details from the state on information received concerning the killing of several members of the Nasa people, including a child, by armed non-state actors on indigenous territories known as resguardos. This communication followed the grave concern and outrage expressed on October 9, 2019, at the killing of Governor Cristina Bautista Taquinas and 4 unarmed indigenous guards, all members of the Nasa people. Previously, in May 2021, a letter was also submitted and also supported by a public press release regarding information received concerning the excessive use of force and firearms by the police and members of the Mobile Anti-Riot Squad against human rights defenders who were protesting peacefully on 28 April 2021 against fiscal reforms. Information received about this incident also alleged possible arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance of these defenders. In closing, I would like to stress the need for the state to provide a safe environment for indigenous people to defend their rights. It is paramount that the state adopt protection measures that are collective and culturally appropriated for indigenous people and in consultation with the affected communities. Also, states need to address the root causes of the violence against indigenous human rights defenders. In particular, a state must end impunity for crimes committed against indigenous human rights defenders, and they must respect and protect indigenous collective right to land, territories, and resources, and the right to free, prior, and informed consent before the development of projects that can impact on their fundamental right as established in international human rights documents such as the UN Declaration of the Right of Indigenous People. Once again, I thank you very much for your attention.
We want to thank the special rapporteur for his remarks for today's event. And something I wanted to highlight is on both Ms. Lawler's and Francisco Cali's remarks, the issue of prevailing impunity as a factor that enables the continuation of the violation of the rights of indigenous peoples, and also tying up something that's currently ongoing or a very recent event, and it's a concerning situation as well, is that similar issues to those that were addressed in the Colombia report and also remarked by Francisco, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, on arbitrary detentions and similar situations where our colleagues or our brothers and sisters in Ecuador just recently went through a similar phase in a conflict that was escalated by the government, by the use of force, that led to numerous detentions of particularly of indigenous leaders, as well as the killing of several people. So, and many of these that were indigenous as well. So it's a concerning situation, and how we see these repeated patterns in more than one country in a period of basically a year in between these conflicts in neighboring countries. So we initially we had our brother Mr. Binota Moitamay scheduled for a statement just in now, but he had to attend an urgent situation, so he excused himself, and if possible, he'll join towards the end of the event, but he wanted to apologize for having to leave earlier today. So that leads us to the next section, which is on the questions and answers or comments from the participants. If any of you would like to make a comment or a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and my colleague Ivan will provide you with permission for speaking on the event, or you can do it through the chat box or the Q&A. In case there are any questions for our colleagues or comments. And I wanted to take the liberty to ask Leonor, given, let's say, the situation raised in the report in relation to what they foresee with this new upcoming administration, if there is any expectation that things might change, or what challenges do they see with the new administration that's coming to Colombia, and given what was just presented in the report, if there are any expectations that things will be different and get better for indigenous peoples.
Gracias. Claro que
Thank
sí.
you. Yes, of course. I think in Colombia at this time, we are being able to have a respite in the hope where we can have a country that we can be on equal footing, to also have social inclusion, to also have recognition of the social state of rights, that would bring peace to our country. I think the president-elect has said that. He is already the president of Colombia because he already has his certification as a president. The Electoral Council has already given him that. So his policies are based on peace and social justice and on environmental justice. These three lines, I do believe, or these three political accesses are the president wants to apply and will lead us to, really gives us a lot of hope. And we do believe that this is possible. And we believe that if we are going to have political change, it will really be constructed on the social basis of Colombia with the indigenous participation. But the youth, the intellectual, the women, the civil society, those in the rural areas, and many Colombians, we all made this possible so that this president would be elected without being murdered, as it has been the history of our country. And we hope that these are some of the guarantees so that this country can advance in the fraternity, solidarity, this guarantee that we have, and we hope that things will change. However, that change will be directed by the political constitution from 91, and the support of the international world will be a way to help to achieve the changes that should be produced in the Colombian society. For that reason, I think that we do have another general way of starting things in the starting with the 7th of August, when we'll have this change of government. Thank you very much, Alankay.
Muchísimas gracias, señora Leonor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Leonor.
I don't see any hands raised yet, but if anyone, again, an invitation for questions or comments. And if I'm missing any of this on the chat box, please help, let me know. Okay, so I don't see yet any hands risen or questions being asked to the speakers, but just to reiterate a couple of things, the reports that are presented today, the one in Colombia as well as the one presented by my colleague Joyce Godio, those are available on IPRI's website. And we yesterday just launched as well the digest on legislation and jurisprudence. So there are various resources that we invite you to see, to follow up on the issues that are happening regarding indigenous peoples, if it's in specific countries or the global trends that IPRI covers on an annual basis with our annual report on criminalization and impunity. And so please feel free at any moment, if also you have any specific questions or anything like that regarding our reports, that you can reach us at any moment, and we'll be happy to provide you with further references. And as well, Indigenous Peoples Rights International has what we call the Legal Defense and Sanctuary Fund. So if at any moment any of you or someone that's known, an Indigenous defender, is under a situation of where their personal integrity or security might be at risk, or they are being criminalized, and these are cases that can be brought forward and can be assessed under the Legal Defense and Sanctuary Fund for financial support. And these are up to $4,000 that can be supported. So we hope that in all these issues that were raised by Mr. Francisco Cali and Ms. Mary Lawler on the continuous, like the numerous cases that they have, that they address on issues related to Indigenous peoples' rights defenders, that if at some point any of these situations requires it, that the Legal Defense and Sanctuary Fund is a tool that can provide a quick response for those situations. And so since I see no questions or comments, I'll give the floor to Ms. Victoria Tauli. And Vicky is an Indigenous, recognized Indigenous activist. She served as as president of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And between the period of 2014 to 2020, she was the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's important to note also that Vicky is the co-founder of Indigenous Peoples Rights International and a member of the global board. So thank you, Vicky, for joining us, and the floor is yours for the closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alangkay, and thank you to all the speakers who have raised this issue, especially the situation in Colombia. I think the situation in Colombia is really representative of a lot of the situations of Indigenous peoples in the rest of the world. Of course, the extent of what is happening in Colombia is maybe multiplied several times over, in other compared to other countries. But I think the situation is also similar to the Philippines, where we come from, as well as to Mexico, and even in Brazil and Peru. No, so these are situations which are not very unique, and it is really very sad to see that this kind of situation continues to happen. And when I made my report on criminalization in 2018, I spelled out very clearly what the recommendations are as far as how to address the situation of criminalization. And in these recommendations, I clearly stated, of course, the responsibility of states to protect Indigenous peoples, as these are their obligations under international human rights law, and that there should be zero tolerance, for criminalization and the assassinations of Indigenous peoples' rights defenders. I also had a recommendation to, of course, the corporations, that was also reiterated by Pancho Cali, in relation to the due diligence that they need to do to be able to address potential human rights impacts and social and environmental impacts. And also I call on the corporations to stop the stigmatization of Indigenous peoples who are protesting against their activities and their projects. There was a specific recommendation as well that I had for national human rights institutions, that they should continue to monitor the situation of criminalization, and they should visit the communities and which are suffering from these kinds of criminalization and violence against Indigenous peoples. And finally, I had a set of recommendations for donors, where I spelled out what is needed for the donors to be able to ensure that they will contribute in lessening the situation of criminalization. So I think that we need to really look into how these recommendations are going to be implemented. And slowly we are able to also get other bodies, like even the Convention on Biological Diversity, in their post 20 their 2030 global plan of action, indigenous peoples have strongly put as one indicator the extent of criminalization and killings of human rights defenders. You know, that if these human rights defenders are defending the biodiversity in their territories are killed, then that should be an indicator of a failure, from the side of governments in relation to protecting biodiversity as well as indigenous peoples. So I think that the situation in Colombia with this new government gives us some kind of hope. But and I think it will be very good to monitor closely the situation in Colombia, because indeed with the new president, the extent of criminalization has decreased, will be decreased significantly. Then it gives us much more hope that we should field candidates, politicians who are really more aware about their obligations in terms of human rights compliance. So I think Colombia is going to be watched very closely, and I guess the Philippines also will be watched very closely, because it's the exact opposite. We now have a president who is the son of the former dictator, and we don't see that the situation is going to become even better, than how it is now. But that is our role. IPRI will play this role, and this is precisely why IPRI has been established, because it will be able to monitor what is happening in different parts of the world, and it will be able to put this in a global database that will really show the trends, whether these trends are going to are becoming much better or even becoming worse. So I think the responsibility of IPRI becomes even heavier because of these kinds of stories that we hear. But I think for the civil society in general, we should really talk more about the stories, of how indigenous peoples are being criminalized, and what kinds of the forms of criminalization that are happening, and the fact that it's not just the individual human rights, but the collective human rights of indigenous peoples that are also affected. No, it's not just the people, it's also the criminalization of their livelihoods, the criminalization of even some of their cultures, And we know that in Nepal, for instance, if they harvest the traditional food that they are eating, then they are also criminalized, So all these forms of criminalization that happen in different parts of the world should really be looked into more deeply and exposed and made more visible. And we should demand all the states who are the ones who are supposed to be the protectors of human rights to adhere to their obligations and comply with their obligations to human rights conventions. I thank Leonor and our people in Colombia who has done the research, and of course the other reports that we have heard, and I think that it's really something that we should be doing continuously, looking into the country situations, because that will really spell out more concretely the realities, and of course help us define further the measures that we are supposed to take. Thank you very much again to IPRI for organizing this, and we look forward to getting more support and solidarity for all the victims of criminalization and assassinations. And we look forward to getting a community that will speak out very loudly and strongly against all this. Thank you, Alangkay.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for those comprehensive remarks on the situation that you were raising. So thank you very much. And this brings us to the end of our side event, and I wanted to thank my colleagues for the work in the preparation of the side event, and as well with the translators, and to thank Leonor, Miss Creamer, Miss Sandra Creamer, and Vicky for the remarks in today's event. So thank you for joining us, as well to all the participants. And if at any point anything you may need from us, please feel free to reach IPRI. And have a good day, a good evening, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.